I know they'll probably allow you an opportunity to sub that type of a thing. Probably gonna have to come back for one more. For what? For the modules that you haven't yet completed. So you might end up coming back for one more. I'm not so sure. Maybe you should just ask students support. But yeah, I think because I mean, if your degree is hanging on this one, they have to find ways at some level. Whether it's creating a special exam for you, like in January sometime, even after the sub, they'll have to find something. Because I mean, you can't come for 3 years, 4 years, whatever time, and then they then say, sorry, since you didn't pass phase out, we can't help you getting a degree. So it's somewhere, I'm sure they'll have to find a way. So with learning unit 4, what's happening over there is you're doing linear programming. Now we're doing linear programming to find out the costs of something. So we don't have all the information necessary to establish the cost, right? So basically, there you're trying to find X or you're trying to find Y, and they'll give you just enough information, and then you must then find, the ideal mix of the two products. So here you can see we have product X and we have product Y, and then the objective function is the contribution, or should I say the marginal income of X plus the marginal income of Y. Okay? So they'll then give you constraints. Constraints are basically limitations. And they'll be saying, okay, you of material B, right, you only have 150 kgs. You can't produce, you can only produce your units, should I say, with 150 kgs. Because that's your limitation, your constraint. Then, with labor hours, you only have 125 labor hours. With processing hours, maybe you have machinery. Your processing hours is 62.5 hours. Okay, that's how much you have. So, if you look here now, based on those constraints, we then basically say, okay, we can actually draw up lines using these constraints. So here, before I go there, we're saying how many hours does it take to produce 1 unit of Y? It takes 2 hours. How many hours of X? How many hours does it take us to produce 1 unit of X? 4 hours. And that's the same thing with the kgs of material, same thing with the processing hours. Does it make sense? So then you say, okay, if X is equals to 0, all right, then how much in terms of labor hours do I have? How much in terms of what's this material B do I have? And that's how we're then formulating those lines. Basically, these equations. When we now have the equations, right, we then say, okay, if we make, for instance, there we have, we're flipping the equations and making Y the subject of each of these. Okay? And then when we made Y the subject, we're saying, okay, if we replace that with 0, what will X be equal to? If we replace Y with 0, what will if we replace Y with 0, what will X be equal to, coordinate-wise? If we replace X with 0, what will Y be equal to? Okay? And that's why you can see here, X is equals to 3.5 and 0. Okay? So, and then here, corresponding, Y is equals to 0 and 3.75. All right? So that's how we then draw the line for number 1. We'll say 375, okay, when when X is equals to 0, Okay, that's the first point that we have there. All right. Then, when y is equals to 0, okay, we know that x is going to be equals to 3.75. That's how we're drawing the orange line. Can you see that? Then we do the same thing for the blue and the purple line. And then this is how we then find out the area where we can begin to play. Okay? Now remember, we're trying to, the reason why we're doing this is to find out what is the maximum number of units that we can produce within our limitations. Does that make sense? And yield the highest possible profit. So those points would come along somewhere on these lines over here.
So the lines have to overlap the axis.
No, they don't have to overlap the axis, but we're looking for where they begin to cross. Because at the point where they are all crossing, then we know, okay, that's the point where we are making the, we're likely to be making the most profit. Yeah, we want to be as close to these lines as possible. Okay. So once you've then done that, we found out our constraints. We then now need to create two simultaneous equations and solve for x and solve for y. Basically, we're solving for how many units we can then produce. They will ask like maybe one question in the exam on this one. So there is theory, but I mean, how do I say this? Yeah, it's mainly calculations. It's mainly calculations, but there is theory, but yeah. So I'm trying to see now. So this is step 4, to do the simultaneous equations. So there you see I've solved for x. Once you've solved for x, then you substitute to solve for y. Okay, then once you've done that, yeah. Then once you've done that, then you know, okay, cool. You're taking your contribution that you make based on that, then you deduct it from your fixed costs, and that's how you arrive at your net profit. Yeah. So this in itself takes quite a few lessons, but I just want to give you the steps. So maybe you can write this down somewhere. Firstly, you want to get your objective function. You can even come and take a picture if you would need. First thing you want to do is get your objective function. Your objective function is your contribution of x and your contribution of y. So you just want to capture where you say number 1 and then objective function.
So I don't have to take a picture
of the whole answer.
Yeah.
You can, it's no problem. This is what I'm trying to give you. These are the steps. 1, get objective function. 2, get the constraints. 4, equations, make y the subject. Then you're solving for x. After you solve for x, you solve for y. Then you substitute x and y, objective function. Sorry, say that again.
Oh.
Does that make sense? So take a picture of this, and then I'm going to, because once you have at least those steps, then when you practice, at least you know, okay, this is what I'm trying to achieve. You take it?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, well, that's fine. Yeah. So let's go on. You'll find 4.2 is the same thing, it's just a different exercise. Let's see what they're saying over here. Okay, so 4.2, I'm just going to, you can see I've done the same steps on the side there, because I'll be basically going with students and saying, okay, cool. So we found the contribution. Okay, now we can do the objective function. So we finished number 1. Let's go now to the constraints. So you need to then establish what are our constraints, what are our limitations. Do we have unlimited materials, or is there a constraint there? We only have so many kgs. And how do you know something is a constraint? Basically, they'll tell you available, we only have 32,500 kgs of material. But how much do we actually need? You'll find that for product A, we need 20,000. For product B, we need 15,000. So can you see, if you add those together, that's 35,000 kgs of material that we need. But we only have 32,500. So can you see, that's a constraint, because we need more than we actually have. So that's how you find if you find that we have 60,000 kgs of materials, but we only need 35,000, then we don't look at it as a constraint. Does that make sense? Yeah. So then, also same principle with labor. We'll say how many hours of labor do we need? 100 hours. How much do we have available? 270. There's no constraint there. We continue. Okay. So that's the issue. Usually you'll find you at least in a question have two constraints, at least, so that you can build those two simultaneous equations. Make sense? So that's step number 2. And step number 3, once you now have your constraints, you now want to build the equations. And can you see the equations we're building based off of the constraints? So they were saying, okay, we know that we only have 32.5 kgs, but how many do we need per unit? Okay, that's how much we need. We know that we only have 270 hours of labor, but okay, fine, we're constrained, but we know for 1 unit of Y we need 20, for 1 unit of X we need 15. Okay, cool. Then here we were creating the equation. So we're doing step 2 and 3 together. So these are the equations. Remember we were saying make Y the subject, but in this first one, Y doesn't need any kgs. So we only have X, that's why it's like that. But here you can see we were making Y the subject of the formula. Okay, from there, now since we have those, let's see what we wrote there for step.
So Y is always the subject?
Yeah, we just do it that way for the sake of getting used to the process. So once we've now made Y the subject, then we solve for X. Because if you were to say, okay, let's make X the subject of the formula, you can do it. It's no problem. But then it means that in step 4, you're now solving for Y. Does that make sense? So this is why I just say, follow this process so you get used to it, and then you know, you're not thinking too much. So once you solve for X, then we solve for Y, and then we substitute into our objective function to find, okay, how many units of this and how many units of that should we produce. Now, with 4.2, here's what they call shadow pricing. So shadow pricing isn't with our limitations. We said, let me go back to our limitations just to show you what I'm talking about. With our limitations, isn't we said that we only have 270 hours, for example, with labor. But now with shadow pricing, they will then say, okay, fine. But what about if we find ourselves in a situation where we actually have only 260 or 250 hours? So they'll change one variable. Does that make sense? When they change it, that means that, oh, our optimum level of production is going to change. Remember, we're doing all this to identify how many units of X and how many units of Y should we produce to meet our maximum profit, right? So if we change our constraint, that means that also the profit that we can potentially make will also change. So that's what they call shadow pricing, where they just change a variable. And they can only change one variable. They can't change two variables at the same time. It's only one. Okay? And then you'll just basically be doing the same calculation over again. So that's what shadow pricing is all about. Yeah, no, it's one of those that really needs practice. But what I can tell you is they don't make it too tricky. They keep it to how it is in it. because they know that, hey, we don't want our students to be like, just to give up. And what they'll then also do is that they will not ask you the whole thing. They usually will ask a section of it, you know. Or they'll give you the constraints, and they'll say, then from there, you know, you just need to build your equation and then continue from there. But yeah, typically, if they do ask you to do the whole thing, they'll make sure that it's very short and to the point, so that you don't waste too much time. Because this thing can chow time. When I'm lecturing, I end up only doing one exercise both sessions. You see, because it's such a process to say, okay, I need to take you step by step. How are we doing this? How are we doing the graphs? Because we also need to do the graphs to post those coordinates. So it really is quite the process. So from there, it doesn't veer too much from that. It's just profit maximization, shadow pricing. Profit maximization, shadow pricing.
So plotting the graph also comes especially with
Yeah, usually they won't like give you graph paper and make you plot, but you will need to do it on the side in order to find the coordinates so you can build your equation. This one, Nesh, is going to require practice from you guys inside. It's going to require practice. There's no shortcut.
get someone
It actually is a good idea. If you get somebody who's managed with the module. I know you have tutors on campus, right? You don't have tutors on campus. No, they have tutors, and they're for free. So what will happen is, yeah, they're for free. It's part of the VC package. Just like, you know, if you need to go see a counselor, it's for free. Yeah. Career support is for free. So yeah, so speak to customer relationship. They'll give you the number of the tutor for this module. Then obviously you just sit and you say, look, man, I need sessions. These are the topics that I want to address or look into. Can you help me with those? Then obviously you begin to say, then between yourselves and you will agree a time when you can meet and then you go through the content. So I don't know why I also didn't think about suggesting that sooner, because that will go a long way. That will go a long way. But what's important is I already know you're pushing on your side. When you go through the content, is to say, look, I'm having a challenge with that exercise, with that. And then when you meet, it's a thing of you're not discussing what you're having a challenge with, you're actually going through it together. That is what's going to help. Because I know sometimes you're just like, yo, I don't understand journals. But which parts in the journals don't you understand? You know what I mean? And then the person is also kind of wasting your time because they're trying to figure out where you're struggling, as opposed to actually delving into the meat of what it is you need help. Yeah. So yeah, but that's unit 4. It's really just this. So yeah, I think we can park it there for today, because then we have unit 5, 6, and 7. I think there's unit 7 here. And then that's it.
So we have 2 more sessions left.
Yeah, we only have 2 more sessions
So for this day, just
for the rest of the year. Yeah, it's a hectic one. So we have to push it 8 units, not 7. Yeah. So if we kill 6 and 7, the next time I see you, I'm sorry, 5 and 6. The next time I see you, then 7 and 8. The last time I see you. No, the next time I see you is on Thursday.
So the thing was, which I don't think last time, attending was one class, so I don't understand why it's happening. Because I usually do
Yeah.
chapters library.
Uh-huh.